Hi there, friend. My name is John Werner. I used to be a part of the largest cult in the United States. After studying the Bible, Christian history, and ministry, I set my sights on confronting the problematic nature of white evangelicalism in the United States. In 2019, I published my first book as a first step in addressing the subtle issues of this complex system. This podcast will continue that work under the same title. Welcome to The Cult of Christianity. On today's show, we have returning guest, back by popular demand, Scott Okamoto. Scott, thanks for coming back.
Hey, it's awesome to be back.
Yeah, yes, big Scott Okamoto fan. I'm more of a fan than a friend, in my opinion. So I'm glad you're back.
We're fans
and then
of each
back
other's
by
stuff.
Yeah, no one asked for this except me. Chris is back as well.
I asked.
Nice.
So Chris,
Yeah.
welcome back to the show.
I love it. So no one asked for this, but I'm giving it to him anyway.
No
I
one
would've.
asked for this. They're like, really? Okay.
It's the story of my life. I just show up. I'm just like, hey, what's up, guys? I'm here now.
Listen,
Yeah.
just for the audience, just listen to me and Scott talk, and then whenever Chris is speaking, just hit that 30-second skip button until he's done talking.
Dude, that 30-second
Aw.
skip button is the key to listening to good podcasts. And you're going to need a lot more than 30 seconds, though, when I'm
I was
speaking.
going to say, is there a 90 option for me?
Now you're talking.
Oh man, we're gonna have a good time today. We're just we're talking about rock and roll, about our history with music in general, and then also this whole concept of secular music. So I want to start with Chris first, just because I think he might have a more kind of interesting take on this. You spoke. Me and Chris had an episode about manipulative music, so we got a little bit into your history with music, but if you could just describe what attracted you to music when you first started playing music, what your relationship to music was growing up, and also while you were becoming an adult.
Man, you just want like an autobiography then, or...
Yeah, I mean, if it's that integral to your personality, kind of describe it.
Well, okay, so I mean, I guess I'd sum it up by saying my relationship with music for most of my life is actually kind of depressing as fuck. Music, I mean, I always liked music, like as a little, kid, like toddler, fan of hearing music in the background. My family pretty much almost entirely only listened to Christian music. And then my relationship to music on an intentional level started when I was 5, when I started taking piano lessons. And then from that point forward, a lot of my relationship with music was basically just stubbornness, because I was refusing to quit taking piano lessons, even though I hated it most of the time. And for that reason, I was then able to play piano when I was like a teenager, on my own terms and the way I wanted to. At that same time, I started listening to music on my own, just like not just whatever was playing on the radio when we got in the car. I could I was burning or ripping CDs to the computer and putting them on a like shitty MP3 player because I couldn't afford an iPod. And then, yeah, I mean, like that's kind of what it looked like at the time. And at that point, of course, it was all quote unquote Christian music. It was very much just the kind of stuff that was playing on Christian radio. And slowly but surely in that period of time, I started listening to these collections of Christian music that would come out every year. This was when CDs were still like the thing. So I would like buy CDs and then rip them to my computer. And it was called the Wow Hits stuff. So this was literally just like all of the, I don't know if you want to call it like the Christian version of Top 40, but it's like the stuff that was basically popping off at the time. And typically the way that would work is there were 2 discs in these things, and the first one would suck. Not that I completely thought that at the time, but it was like, it's just like the stuff I would hear on the radio. And then the second side of it was like, I don't know, a lot more edgy. Super cringe to look back on now. I like some of the stuff. I was like, wow, that's really, really bad. But at the time, it was like my introduction into like hip hop, but especially Christian rock. And I started to kind of have my own taste at that point, where I started realizing I liked like heavier music and all these things. But I still had this like really strong affinity for Christian music and a really strong distaste or fear that was instilled in me of quote unquote secular music.
I have a question. When you're talking about like the rap and rock, are you talking about like DC Talk, Toby Mac, like those kind of
Oh, geez, yeah.
vibes?
Unfortunately, yeah.
Gotcha.
Toby Mac is definitely up there. I mean, around this time is then when I started getting exposed to, like, I guess Lecrae is a good example. Um, and it was kind of just like this, like, oh, that's kind of cool, you know. Later, when I was in high school, I started to get more into it. And there's an artist I still listen to who, at the time, was a Christian artist called Propaganda that I got really into. But that was much later on.
I still like Propaganda. Not
Oh,
gonna
he's
lie.
straight up. He's good. Also, he's pretty woke now, so it's like
Yeah.
he's not evangelical anymore, so it's easier to listen
Correct. Yeah.
to.
I've
But
never heard
yeah,
of
so
any of
like
these people.
there
So
was
I'm
that,
old.
but then then we're listening to like Skillet and Red and Switchfoot and some of these other bands.
Oh, I know them.
And that was the like kind of general center to my music taste up until college. So I started to like find my own music, download music, steal music, pay for music, whatever I was doing. But it still was always like the game of like, is this a Christian band? You know, like I couldn't get into music unless I felt like I knew they were Christians. And then I was like more committed to that whole concept than most people who were like that. So, you know, there's a lot of people who are like, well, they say they're Christians, or they think, you know, like in the liner notes, it says that they thank God, you know, so they you know, they're Christian enough to listen to. For me, it was like, are they singing about God or are they not? If they're not, why would I listen to it? Why should I care? And it wasn't until like my senior year of high school that I started to realize that that was not great, and kind of start expanding my ability to listen to things that were not straight up just Christianity in song, you know?
Chris, did you ever hear like other stuff? Like,
Yeah, like literally like listening to pop songs on the radio. And like
yeah,
for the first time being able to know like
it didn't resonate.
what
Like,
yeah,
sound
well,
different?
like even just knowing the songs straight up, like I was so out of touch with the culture and with, you know, all of that. Um, and it was a slow process of like kind of getting into more and more things and learning about different artists. And frankly, I didn't really start like intentionally like getting into, um, again, like I feel like I have to say quote unquote because it sounds so stupid to me now, but into secular music, it was not something I was like getting into and really in like intentionally listening to specific artists or albums or anything like that until I was like almost done with college. That's when I really started to go from like, oh yeah, like, oh, there's this is a fun song or like whatever, to like, oh, have you heard like Kendrick Lamar's last album? It's really good, you know. That was it was a long journey to get to that, from when I was a kid, and had to convince my dad that if I got an iPod that I put Christian music on it, you know? Like it was just a very
Whoa.
very chaotic journey to get to that point.
Scott, I'm assuming that story is a little bit different than yours.
It's kind of the opposite. It's like
Yeah.
the polar opposite of my experience.
Yeah, well, I kind of want to I want the contrast. So Scott, what was music for you in your
Here's the
world?
contrast. So my parents didn't grow up Christian. So my dad was raised in Pasadena, California, in a predominantly black neighborhood. So all his friends were black and Japanese American, and so he grew up listening to, you know, the golden age of R&B. So he had these boxes of like 45 records. Do you guys know what that is? Those little smaller records that spin at 45
Yes,
RPMs. Okay,
I do.
Yeah, you guys-
I might be the last generation that does, but yes.
Okay, yeah. So he would, whenever he would get like sentimental, he would bust out this box and listen to like the OJs or Wilson Pickett or the Supremes, like he had this great collection of music. And so that was my upbringing. And one of my earliest memories, and I write about this in a blog post, was I think I was 6, and we had this radio on our kitchen counter, and whenever Stevie Wonder's songs, pretty much any Stevie Wonder song came on, I would climb up onto the counter and just put my head against the radio to hear the vibrations and just to feel the music. And so that was like my earliest memory. And so I grew up listening to all kinds of music. My parents it was the disco era, it was the 70s. But then the first time I heard Another One Bites the Dust by Queen, I felt like my world was changed when the guitar comes in. And I saved up money and bought Queen's record, the game, and just stared at like Freddie Mercury and Brian May and just how cool they looked. And by this time I was going to church. I was probably in elementary school. And it felt forbidden. But to my parents' credit, they had by then drank the Kool-Aid and became hardcore Christian. To their credit, they didn't limit what I could listen to, like some of my friends in church. So as long as it didn't have like a pentagram on the cover.
That's so important. When you, first off, awesome that your first like album was Queen, because mine was the freaking Beach Boys. So good on you for going
Brian
for
Wilson,
Queen.
good songwriter. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, good songwriting, sure. I was attracted to the songwriting, but boy, there's better stuff out there. Well,
that was my first record.
So
my first
worse.
record was kids stuff. Yeah, I had Bullfrogs and Butterflies and really crappy Christian kids music. But that was the first
that's
real
interesting.
record. Yeah.
So it's good that your parents weren't restricting you, but did you feel like there were any like fine distinctions between Christian music and secular music?
There was a hard distinction. Christian music sucked. There was hardly any. Everyone was really into Keith Green, and I never understood it because he just sounded like, I don't know, like your dad singing or something. He had some deep lyrics.
It's funny you say that because my dad loved Keith Green.
Yeah, see,
Same,
it's of a certain
actually.
generation. Your parents are probably around my age, so yeah.
Not mine. No, much older.
Okay.
Because of that, I grew up on Keith Green as one of the artists of choice.
Right?
That's amazing.
It's all Christian households have Amy Grant and Keith Green. I feel like it's kind of standard issue.
Well, Amy Grant got divorced. She wasn't allowed in our.
Well, yeah, later.
It's true.
But
She
like
got too secular, so then we had to replace her with Stephen Curtis Chapman.
Yeah. But in the 70s and in the 80s, she didn't come until the 80s. If you accepted Jesus in your heart, they handed you Keith Green and Amy Grant records. That's just so. Anyway, music sucked. It was like it was all just like a bad copy of normal music. So I'd go to the Christian record store and they'd be like, "What music do you like, young man?" And I'd tell them like the bands I like. Oh, well, then you should listen to this band. And there would be some band I never heard of, and they all kind of sucked, and they were just bad approximations of rock, poorly produced, poorly written, kind of sloppy. So it wasn't until like the 90s that I guess Christian music kind of, I don't know, got better. I do remember do you guys remember a band called Striper? They were really good at first.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
They were a pretty good approximation of Motley Crue's first album. But again, it was just literally just like, we're going to do Motley Crue, but we're going to sing about Jesus. It was not original. It was not, but yeah, so there wasn't much. So in my mind, I felt obligated to listen to Christian music because I was a good Christian boy. But damn, it was like that music couldn't touch. This is like when U2 is coming out with their first few records. Van Halen is at its height. I was into Rush. I was into the Police. These bands are just, amazing and still hold up to this day. And almost, I don't think anything I listened to back then holds up. No, they don't. Do you guys know of a group called Petra?
Yep.
Yeah.
They had several iterations, several versions of it, but I started listening to the early one, and that was about as good as it got in like the early 80s for rock. And there was a band called Undercover too, so they were pretty good, but still. It was not, yeah.
What got you into play? Like, when did you start play? We'll stay on you, Scott, and then I also want to hear from Chris too. When did y'all start like playing music, and when was it lessons, or when was it like you playing music you wanted to play? Because I feel like there's a
Yeah.
journey there a lot of the time.
Yeah, like Chris, I started playing piano as a kid. I didn't really take to it, but I loved playing. I started playing clarinet in band in elementary school, and then I got a acoustic guitar, so I could play. My parents got me that because they thought, well, that's you could play in the worship band or something. Real high Christian aspirations. That's the highest, really. Um, so I learned my open chords and could play some, Jesus Loves Me type songs. But then I went over to a friend's house and he had just got a new Sony Walkman. This had been like 1980 or 81. And he put these little orange headphones on my head. He hit play and Van Halen's Eruption came on. And that was like a life altering moment for me. I was like, what is that? That I want that, and so I started saving up for an electric guitar and got my first really crappy sort of Strat copy with really crappy humbucker pickups in them. But I just banged away at that with this little tiny PV amp that was like, a foot and a half tall. Sounded like, like an ice pick in your ear. It was not a good sound, but it had distortion. So I started
Distortion's
playing
all
in
you
like a
need.
band, right? That's all you need. It sits in the mix. So I started learning how to like shred and play all this metal and rock. And I took a few lessons, but I have a pretty good ear. I just sort of taught myself how to play everything, and that was that. It was the first step of my deconstruction, I think.
Yeah, it often can be, especially like the whole rebellious nature something like rock music can kind of like instill in you on an emotional level.
Yeah, right.
um
Mm.
Chris, I know you basically played piano, you had piano lessons, but most of your playing experience was in church, right?
Yeah, I started playing when I was really little, and then had classical training and lessons going on until I was, I think, a sophomore in high school is when I finally stopped doing that. In middle school, I started kind of messing around with chord charts and playing worship music from church. And I started getting pretty good at that around my freshman year of high school. Started leading worship at youth group. That became my thing probably when I was, I think, the transition between sophomore and junior years when I started doing that to the point that I was actually leading. And in my senior year, I ended up doing an internship at my church with our worship leader, worship pastor, whatever you want to call it, and got way more involved on like the main church stage, I guess, and led some services there, which is kind of at this point I was beginning to decide that that's what I was going to do with my life, which is then what led me to Bible college, was thinking that I was going to become a worship pastor. But yeah, it was just a slow transition, I guess, over my adolescence from piano lessons, is playing music and kind of hating music theory and not understanding what the point of it is, to starting to like be invested in what I was playing on my own. And worship music, like at the time too, was really, I was very emotionally invested, and music became kind of how I felt and communicated emotions. I was not very emotionally intelligent or able to feel or express my feelings very well as a teenager. And music gave me an outlet that allowed me to do that, which is probably also then why I ended up getting really into heavier Christian rock, was because that actually reflected the feelings I was having but not able to experience, I guess. I don't know how to put that in better terms. Um,
Yeah.
it's funny that you talk about that rebellious like aspect of rock, and like on an emotional level, how that could start your deconstruction. So that's basically exactly what my dad feared. Um,
It was true.
when I was, yeah, well, it's funny too, because for me, I thought it was so silly, and the deconstruction didn't happen for decades. But I remember being pretty young, and my brother played guitar. He's a very good guitarist. he had an acoustic guitar and was learning that. And at some point, he wanted to get an electric guitar. And I remember this was before our church started becoming a little more contemporary. So electric guitars really were not a big part of our musical repertoire. And my dad, I remember my dad being really nervous and cautious and uncomfortable. And I remember it being explained to me that, like, well, electric guitars get used in a lot of very bad music, evil music. And so it's maybe, it's a big deal if Josh starts playing electric guitar. That's kind of a potentially could cross over into a big no, I guess. And then eventually, like, we all just decided that didn't matter. But that was the underlying foundation of where my family was, where I came from. And yeah, I mean, like, literally, like, I joked about it earlier, but the comment about, like, if I got an iPod, my dad being like, well, what kind of music would you be putting on it? And the obvious answer, like I said defensively, it was like, well, Christian music, you know. And my parents always were really uncomfortable with the music I listened to when I was a teenager because it would scare them. If I listened to any bands that crossed over into like hardcore and there'd be screaming or something like that, and I just wouldn't listen to it in out loud anywhere around them because it would make them so uncomfortable and weird about it.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Well, so I might as well give some of my own context too, because I have a really strange kind of middle of the road between y'all two experience.
All right.
So first off, my whole dad's side of the family, and even my mom's side too, is musical, musically gifted. You know, can sing, can play, whatever. Had piano lessons when I was 9. It wasn't under the pretense of like worship music or anything like that. Like, it was just like, no, you should learn piano as your like music credit because you're homeschooled and you have to have something as your music credit.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So there was never like a fear of music in general. Like, there wasn't any rhetoric about like how dangerous music could be or anything like that. But what's interesting is, personally, my interest in music, like I said, my first album was the greatest hits of the Beach Boys. It was like a 2 CD thing, and it was all, whatever. And I remember at the time what I was impressed with was how high they sang. I was like, how can a guy sing that high? That's amazing,
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't very profound. But but so I didn't really have that big of an interest until I remember, this is so interesting, but the first time my dad would always listen to 97.1 here in Atlanta, which is the classic rock station. And so I would hear a lot of like classic rock music, and I would always be kind of mesmerized. I would go into like almost a trance when I would hear it, because it was so, the classic rock era was just so dramatic, and so like it had movements. Like, it was just like this, it felt like an experience when you were listening to it. Scott brought up Queen. Like, Queen is like it's like you're listening to a play in 3 minutes. Like, it's just incredible what they're doing. But I remember the first time, the song that kind of awoke me was Dream On by Aerosmith, because it was just such a like, it was so strange for me to hear a rock song that was like somber and like, but like a hopeful message. There was just so much in my little 12-year-old mind, like this complexity that I just had never experienced before emotionally, right? Like, I was like, what's happening right now? Because I grew up on hymns. I didn't grow up on any contemporary music. And so like so I had this weird bifurcation of like singing really dull 1600 drinking songs that were then appropriated as Christian music. And so like I didn't really have like this understanding that like the of rock music. But my dad was always like, yeah, the Beatles are great. We would watch Ed Sullivan and like see the Beatles on there, and it'd be like, what is happening? My dad was a bit of a hippie, before both in his early Christian days and before he was a Christian. And so he loved all of it. Like, he loved music. And one of the first things he did as a Christian was he did this ministry to people in jail. And what they would do is like he was part of a band and he played acoustic guitar for the band. So he kind of had this like cool relationship with music where he loved he loved like singing. He loved, like he was a big fan of Crosby, Stills and Nash. And so he kind of had this like depth to him that like would leak out. He wouldn't talk about it a lot, but it was just obvious when I was like in the car with him and on the radio and stuff. So I wasn't really that interested in playing music. I took piano lessons when I was 9 until age 11, and I freaking hated it. Like, I hated sight reading. I hated like being told that I wasn't quite hitting the key correctly, that kind of technical stuff. Like, I just hated all of that. So, sit up straighter, like all that stuff was just like, ugh, I hate this.
Did you ever argue with your piano teacher?
No. I was too.
But at that, you're a good boy.
This was before my. Believe it or not, Chris, there was an age where I wasn't argumentative.
Whoa.
But it was only the first 10 years. Yeah. So like I did. No, my piano teacher made me cry a couple times just because I was so like sensitive about like I wanted to do it correctly, and she would get upset when she could tell I didn't practice or like do my homework or whatever. So I kind of like left music behind. So I had like that baseline musical theory knowledge, just like very basic, like this is what a key is, this is what a time signature is, all that. And so then like after, getting more interested in classical rock music, I had a friend come up and say, "Hey, I'm trying to start a band." And I was like, "That's cool." And he's like, "You play bass, right?" And the reason he thought I played bass was because I had done this little dumb video with my cousin where I like fake played a bass. He just told me the one note to hit over and over again, and so that's all I did.
You were
and
convincing.
So yeah, which I mean, yeah, of course, it's not that much more intense than what a real bassist does. But so I was like, yeah, I play bass, and he's like, cool, you should be in my band. And so I immediately go, Mom, Dad, I need a bass for Christmas because I need to learn how to play this thing because I'm going to be in this band. And so we started the band, and I had learned bass basically in a matter of a couple months, trying to just like pass as like a bassist for this band. And so it started when I was 12, 13. Our band name was Forever I Fall. We were very emo, and very like kind of. But what was funny was we posed as more emo than we were. I mean, our music was borderline just like pop music, but with distortion. And then we would like scream, and that was kind of it. But band found moderate success in the local scene, and so like I just got better, like just playing with people. I had learned ukulele, I had learned piano. I just kind of kept learning. Eventually, you learn bass, you can do some basic stuff on guitar, and then I start learning chords and whatever. And so music all of a sudden became much less about what I was listening to and became much more about what I was able to express with it. Like it became less of an entertainment or like enjoying the art and more about like, it became very personal. It became like this emotional thing that I really connected to. Which was interesting, but I had this super religious life, but for me, they were like completely disconnected. I liked playing worship songs. I remember the first time I went to like a contemporary youth group service and they were like rocking out, and I was like, well, this is kind of cool. Because it was a new experience. I was like, I've never seen someone like have a guitar solo in a worship song. I was like, this is interesting. Like, and I had kind of a mix of y'all's feelings. I think I had like, well, at least there's good Christian music, that because I didn't believe that really existed, I'd never listen to Christian radio. Anytime it would accidentally be on, I'd have that same kind of nauseous feeling of like, this is terrible. But then like I also had this like, but all music should be about God. And so like I was like, I kind of was all in for like the contemporary vibe, because it felt so rebellious compared to my traditional upbringing. My parents weren't in love with my band. We didn't do Christian songs or anything. They were all like breakup songs. And so they had an interesting relationship, and we would play at these skeezy, like sketchy venues. And
Oh,
we're all teenagers in the band just playing at these like really
yeah.
hole in the wall, people drinking out of flask and shooting up in the back kind of venues. And so my parents came to almost every show, and they're like, what is this? What is my son getting into? um but they were kind of in that we don't want to not support him. They were kind of wrestling with the question. I don't think they were taking a hard stance. They weren't necessarily supportive, but they didn't want to be prohibitive either. And so yeah, they were kind of in that mid zone. So I don't know, my relationship with music was really interesting, which is why when me and Chris finally met at Moody, and this whole opportunity for chapel music came up, like I initially was like, no, I have no interest in that, until I met Taylor Song, and he kind of dragged me into it a little bit. He was like, no, we can do music that's good. And so I was like, all right, I'm in. So that was kind of my experience. But yeah, it's interesting how, I don't know, do y'all feel like that happened too? You had that like transition from music being something you consume to part of your personality?
Oh yeah, yeah, 100%. I just don't know if I could put my finger on exactly when. I think it was a slow transition. But high school, I think, is generally when I would start pointing to that, where I just started to live and breathe music. That was my existence. That's what gave me purpose and meaning, was to not just consume it, but to be like totally and completely wrapped up in it, and then to play it all the time. Even if now I'd look back and think it was pretty much garbage, um, that was super important to me, and it kind of took over and became my personality in some ways.
Yeah, I'm kind of the same. Um, so funny story. Um, summer camp, church camp, summer camp. The camp speaker gave this crazy talk about how he used to listen to the Eagles, but then God told him that Satan lived in his Eagles records, and so he took his records out to his backyard and he set them on fire. And he said he heard demons screaming as his records burned. And he told us if we listened to secular music, we were inviting the devil into our hearts. I was concerned, so I asked my parents if I could burn my records, and they said no, it's a fire hazard. Thank goodness. So it really took a deep dive into this, like, because they always told us at church, if you listen to something that's satanic or secular, same thing, you're inviting Satan into your heart, and your heart will know. The Holy Spirit will convict you. And I never felt that conviction. So in my mind, music was kind of all just one thing. That whether it was worship music or Christian music or secular music, as long as I wasn't explicitly saying I love the devil or something, it was still just music. And I had a turning point in 1984. I was at a Rush concert and I heard my favorite song played live for the first time. It's called Spirit of Radio. And I started crying. And it was really weird because I never cried it during church like that. I never felt that depth of emotion in a church service. I was moved and I liked worship music and I liked doing worship, but I never was moved to tears. And that was concerning to me. But I rationalized that it was that all truth is God breathed. They're all, beauty is truth. And so I integrated secular music into Christian music as long as it was artistic and artful and or somewhat meaningful. It was in my mind all the same thing.
I think that's very interesting. The idea of kind of having an emotional connection to secular music, because I also felt something kind of similar, because I didn't really have an emotional. I had some emotion attached to hymns, and still do to some extent, to be honest. And then I kind of had this weird thing with contemporary music where I thought the lyrics were awful and I hated them, but I was like, but there's some stuff that like the bands were doing that was kind of cool. And so I kind of had this weird relationship with Christian music, but secular music meant when secular music meant something, I feel like it meant so
Yeah.
much more. Like
Mhm.
Yeah.
it was like,
Yeah.
this is so integral. Scott, I have one question for you specifically, just because I know me and Chris have talked about this before, and just about kind of Bible college, since obviously, chapel probation, you're talking about Bible colleges and Christian
Yeah.
colleges a lot. When you were a professor at APU, did you like notice a cultural difference between students who were musicians and students who weren't musician? Was there any kind of like personality difference or anything?
Yeah. Ooh. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I always relate better to musicians, so there's a personal level to that. But yeah, I think anyone who can look at the world through a musical lens has a unique view. And so um in most cases, yeah, there's a good difference. I mean, there was still the sort of true believers that were only saw music as a missionary tool, an evangelistic thing that they were going to use to spread Jesus. And I don't think those people ever understood really what music was about. But they weren't the majority. I think most people who study music and really get into music have a unique worldview because it's like a different language, right? It's a different approach
It's
to
definitely a
the
different
world.
language. I
Yeah.
completely agree with that. And like one of the cultural differences, and Chris, feel free to chime in here. Like one of the differences I feel like we notice, like, so not naming any names, but like half the people who played music on chapel teams at Moody ended up being disciplined for something at some point down the road.
It's a good
There was
point.
just which I think speaks to like kind of a like yeah, kind of a rebellious spirit maybe, but all like not in a bad way. I don't use that term in a negative way.
Yeah, 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 I get it.
But also like a sort of like depth, right? Like I agree it's
Yeah.
another language, so you kind of like have like a different worldview. I don't know, Chris, what do you know what I'm talking about when I talk about those kind of personality differences between musicians and the rest, especially in the Christian world?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think there's the band side of things maybe plays a role in this, but broadly speaking, I think you could still argue that a lot of times you could find sort of like semi cliques appearing and growing around the musicians, um, especially those who are actively playing a lot of music. Um, and I think it's just there is something that you have in common. Even if it's a very distant connection, like I could get along with and connect with when I worked at a church as a contemporary worship leader, like I connected with the organist. We're very different people, very different personalities, and completely different taste in music. This guy was eccentric as all hell, but we got along relatively well and connected because we were younger than most of the people in the church, and because we understood like what it means to be a musician and be a musician in a church, and we had mutual respect for each other. There's just something that kind of plays into that. But yeah, Moody, especially, I would say I saw that too. It was maybe only half and half, but there were people who were very much on the rebellious end of the spectrum. And honestly, what I was going to say
Yeah.
is you saw a lot of people. We had sometimes less quality musicians playing on these chapel teams, partly because the talented people just weren't allowed on in the first place. So there were people who were disciplined, but there were also a bunch of people who
Oh.
just were not permitted to join these teams because, they for one reason or another, you sinned a little too much too publicly, and so you're off. You can't join, you can't sing, you can't play, whatever it is. You're not
Well, it
welcome.
was one of the few things they could take away from you legally, I think. It
That
was just
too.
like it was like here's the thing we can take away from you. But it is true. That's a thought too, is like because there was some talent at Moody. But not only were they not permitted, some of the talent was like, I'm not gonna do that. Like I'm not gonna like, you know, play shitty music.
Yeah.
Yep.
Like I'm just like I don't like just not wanting to do it. Or like there were some cast of characters that would only play for like special events but would never play
Yeah.
regular because they were like
Yeah.
I need to be paid if I'm going to be doing this.
Well, I have a funny story about that because I was part of a group of English majors that they would read poetry, and we would pass like a either a joint or a bong around before we started. And one night I went over to do the readings, and the whole worship team for the Wednesday night chapel was sitting at this table. And it's like an hour before chapel starts, and we're like off campus by a few miles. And I look around, and I'm like, "Aren't you guys the chapel team?" Because I seen their pictures like on the promotional. They're like, "Yeah, we have to get high before we do chapel. It's the only way we can make it through." So
Amazing.
yeah, to your
I
guys'
love that.
point, yeah, the rebels.
Well, yeah, but you know, obviously, like music in some sense, like there's some. Well, we'll get into that a little later. I want to talk about that association of just like kind of drug use or experimentation with music too, because I think it's kind of interesting how that plays into this conversation. But let's talk about art just in general a little bit, because I think that's also relevant to just how Christians kind of, or even former Christians kind of understand like the secular versus sacred or whatever. So I'll ask you first, Scott. Is there such a thing as immoral art? Because we know there's immoral artists and we know
Right.
there's bad artists, you know, like people
Sure.
who are not good. But what about art? Can art truly be bad in the same way?
Yeah, I mean, depending on how we're defining our terms, um, like if Hitler commissioned artists, was it was it Mahler? You can ask yourself, do I want to listen to this music that was meant to glorify, the Third Reich or something? So I would say generally, yeah, but cautiously, yeah, because I'm more on the side of art is there to be experienced in all of life's complexities of human condition. So like if you asked me if like nudity or sexuality was bad, I would say no. Um, but it can be used to depict or glorify things that are not good for society. So yeah, am I answering your question? Is that what you're getting
I
at?
think so, because it sounds like you're almost talking about the messaging of the art, right? Like it depends on like the message of art could be bad, right?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So as far as are you talking about the quality of like
Well, yeah, we all know there can be just bad. Well,
yeah,
actually, quality is also an interesting
well, right.
conversation in
It's
the postmodern world.
right.
Can
But
start all kinds of arguments with that.
Right.
yeah, exactly. Um, but no, yeah, it's just I don't think it's an answer that has a correct. I don't think it's a question that has a correct answer. But because I
Oh, good.
tend
I
to
didn't get
go
it
where
wrong.
you go, where art is meant to, or not necessarily, art can be provocative, right? Like art can be this thing that like can kind of stretch boundaries and like make us think about things that, you know, maybe broader society doesn't want us to think about.
Yeah. It depends on who you're asking too, right? Because like a lot of Christians say all this art's bad because it goes against their beliefs. But and from my view, it shed light on the human condition in all its complexity, so it's
Mhm.
good to me. So um,
Right.
yeah,
Right. And it does vary case by case, you know, context
yeah,
is
yeah,
important
for sure.
and the rest of it. I just think it's an interesting kind of philosophical question that the Christian is forced to say, of course there is. Right?
Yeah,
Like they have to say there is bad art, there is immoral art. Like
yeah.
in their
If there's a
system it
bad
would make
word or a
Yeah.
nipple or
Heaven
there's
forbid.
well,
certain
but
lines.
even in like a deeper theological sense, just because everything has a good and bad attached to it, right? Like
Right. Yeah.
there
Black
is
and
no
white.
thing, yeah, there is no thing that can be gray. Like,
Right.
like so I just think it's an interesting question to pose both to artists and to art consumers of like what is immorality in art even a thing? What do you think, Chris?
I'm wrestling with that a little bit as I'm listening to you guys. I'm thinking about, for me, I guess as I've completely shifted into a very different worldview and way of thinking, in the same way that my viewpoint of ethics tends to shift over to centering around consent, I guess art kind of has a similar mindset for me. So there's on a moral level, I guess what I first think of when it comes to what immoral art might be or mean. I think of exploitation, and I don't know, any kind of art that, and this also gets kind of funky because then you start arguing about what art is and what isn't art. It goes back to that Supreme Court argument over whether something is pornography or art, and you just know it when you see it. And then now I'm like, well, you could argue about whether pornography itself is art, but at some point it stops being art and starts being exploitation. I mean, certainly that would be the case with anything like child porn or anything like that. Um, I feel like in our society, sometimes when it's exploitative, we just stop calling it art and start calling it, horrible.
Yeah.
But I think that still is a useful tool. I mean, because you can even look at, like, to some extent, I suppose, writing, poetry, music. There are ways you can still be exploitative just in what you choose to say. But typically, I feel like art isn't necessarily moral or immoral. It is an expression of the, like Scott was saying, the complexity of the human experience, the human condition. I have trouble trying to, like, actually say one thing is good or bad. And I did like that you actually brought up, like, there is also something to, talking about art that is there to prop up and support empire or I guess white supremacy or something like that, where, the whole purpose of this piece of art, quote unquote, is just to tear somebody else down or to glorify an evil regime or something like that, because it can be used for propaganda and things like that. I think that at least deserves a place in the conversation. If you can't say straight up that it's immoral, it's certainly being used for immoral purposes.
I get hung up on that here because I agree with you, I think. But, like, this is where I get hung up. I'm like, okay, so art is expressing something more or less, right? Because there's obviously different mediums, there's different, art, even what qualifies as art has certainly changed throughout history. When if you're expressing something that is bad, you're expressing something that is bad, right? I'm not arguing with that. I'm more like, but does that make the art itself, like, this is kind of like, I mean, it's a very relevant conversation actually to the past few years, where there's kind of this, like, there's this analyzation of, like, does art need to come from a good person? Well, then it's like, well, what's a good person, right? Like, let me blow this conversation up a little bit with a real life example, because I think I hate to bring this up, but I think it's the best case study. I think it's the best case study I can think of. What do we think about Kanye West and his relationship? Just like, because he's such a fascinating case study when it comes to this conversation, in my opinion. Because clearly condemn, I'm not trying to support Kanye's a bad person. Like, I'm not, there's Kanye gets no love from me. But what I'm curious about is his relationship with evangelicalism, because when Kanye first started, it was certainly a very different Kanye than the Kanye we're dealing with now. Where does his old art become bad? Does his new art become good to someone else? These are the questions that may seem kind of like we all want to have those rigid answers, right? Like, this is good, this is bad, this is good, this is bad. But I think that gray is an interesting area to explore. I don't know. That was just kind of a launching point I wanted to throw out there and try to have a real life example to this conversation.
Oof.
Good
I
luck,
remember
y'all.
when his first
Neither of us want to touch this with a 10-foot pole.
No, I know. Choosing our words carefully. I remember when the first record came out. I was a pretty new professor at a Christian college, APU, and my students were just buzzing about this rapper who was singing about Jesus or rapping about Jesus. And I heard it and it was like, it's okay. It's not my thing. So yeah, compare that to what he is now. I don't know. I'm never going to be someone that censors art. Me personally. Others, I'm not thrilled about his misogynistic lyrics. And forget about the anti-Semitism, of course. But I've never been a big fan of Kanye just because some of the darker sides of hip hop culture. So that's just me. And then as soon as he compared himself to Miles Davis, I was out. I was like, you are no Miles Davis, sir. So I just brought up 3 levels of different good or bad scenarios. There's the quality of the art, and it's fine. He is what he is, but he's not Miles Davis. You know, he didn't learn an instrument and know music theory and change music 7 or 8 times. He might have changed music a few times, but anyway, not my thing. But then what it represents, I would personally choose not to purchase or consume his art. And I do think it's art, and I think it's valid, and I don't judge people who like it. But I do think there are some harmful elements to his art, and it's a conversation. And again, this is not me censoring or canceling. This is me saying there's a conversation there, and maybe that's a sign of what good art is, right? It's like asking us to ask questions and to push back. So there's my political answer.
Well, I certainly agree that art has this kind of side of provoking questions, right? It's so hard when you break it down to the level of what do you do with the character who created the art, right?
Right.
Because it's like and again, it's even really, if you want to just completely derail a conversation, you can talk about how Hitler wanted to be an artist and really start doing like mental gymnastics in your head. But what I think about art is it's definitely like a very pure form of expression that can't quite be named. Like you can't quite describe it. The reason of bringing up Kanye West is not to say necessarily whether listening to Kanye West is an immoral act. I really don't have that much of an interest in that conversation. I tend to skew on it's very much up to the individual to think through those questions and answer them themselves. But it is interesting, right? Because you have this like the reason I like the Kanye example is only because I'm like, this is a man who you would never expect to be friends with Joel Osteen like a decade ago, right? Yeah. And like I remember me and my worship buddy at my church when I first moved to Spokane would listen to Kanye West after and feel rebellious. Like, this is so funny. We're listening to Kanye West after we just played a worship song. And so now we have this weird new Kanye that's clearly an egomaniac, as is, other figures like Trump, Driscoll, like, egomaniacs have been more and more out, so to speak, as evangelical than in the past.
Yeah.
Or at least flirting with evangelicalism. But yeah, I just think that's very interesting because I'm about to shift the conversation into how Christians kind of manipulated that whole good versus bad thing. And I think what's hard about approaching that topic is what they can do very well is point at our lack of ability to do that. Like non-Christian people don't really have the ability to say this is definitely right and this is definitely wrong the same way Christians do. Now, in my opinion, Christians are running into a lot of problems with that, especially as late, because it's like, wait, you're supporting someone who goes against all the values you've been touting for the past 60 years. But still, like it's an interesting. I just want to acknowledge that before approaching the topic to say, look, I'm coming from this at an angle of I think the good bad dichotomy is not helpful for this conversation.
Yeah. So I brought up Miles Davis, who was, by all measures, a pretty horrible human being. He treated women very badly. He's a musical genius. Look at Picasso, put cigarettes out in women's arms and was a total misogynist. It's a valid question to ask. Does that affect the art that these people produce? The fact that they weren't stellar human beings. They had good qualities, I'm sure. But I think it's fair to ask all these questions when we consume or look or take in art, to say maybe nothing is perfectly good or perfectly bad. It's just it's always asking us to interrogate where we're coming from and how we're consuming it and how it's affecting our lives and our point of view. Because I'm never going to be one that says that you can't read something or watch something or listen to something or anything, because you can read Mein Kampf and not become a Nazi. and you can,
I'm
but you can
case in point.
understand.
Case in point,
Yeah,
I've done it. I'm not
yeah,
a Nazi, and I've read it. So
yeah. I've read half of it, and so I'm not half a Nazi. Yeah, so yeah, so that's all. Before we shift into the what you're saying, the
no,
Christian
I think
point of
that
view.
I think that's a really important thing because censorship doesn't usually prevent much. It just kind of it's kind of like putting your whole finger in a hole in a dam and it just spurting out
Yeah,
somewhere
or it
else
can
a lot of
glorify
the time.
what
Yeah,
it
it can
stands
make
for.
something
Yeah, it
even
can.
more attractive to other people.
Right.
Yeah,
If
it can
you,
give it too much attention even.
I was going to say, there's a difference too between like censorship and deplatforming. Which, I mean, deplatforming is used as a euphemism for just quote unquote canceling, I guess. Just it's hit or miss for me. But you can see sometimes a positive effect to certain types of people, public figures being rejected or silenced by the mainstream, and that their voices simply are not expanded to as wide an audience. So you could make an argument that like deplatforming Kanye West and having his voice taken away from a lot of different social media channels could be a good thing. Same thing could even be said for his music publishers. Like those kinds of things could have a positive effect, but censorship straight up, even on a cultural level, I think is more of a problem than a helpful thing. But what I was thinking of earlier, though, is how interesting it is that I feel like there's such a strong difference between consuming and participating in the art of problematic, very like actively problematic person in the present, and consuming in the same way that art of a problematic person who's dead. It's really weird to realize that pretty much every artist throughout history has some, dark sides to their past, and to know that's true of the present as well. But some of these people, I mean, Scott brought up some great examples, and it goes definitely beyond music, where some of these artists have done horrible things or were extremely violent or abusive or misogynistic or racist or a combination of those. But that doesn't take away the fact that their art still has value and meaning, not to mention historical value and just the simple way that it affected history and the history of art. You can say those things about Kanye too. But that I think that while I might be comfortable listening to music by some classical composer here or there, or I might be down to enjoy like looking at a Picasso, I'm also gonna not be interested in listening to Kanye West because I don't want to download and stream anything and provide him with any kind of financial benefit, even if it's just a few cents, just out of principle. But that's also something that I think I feel is a moral choice that someone makes, not a choice that you should make for other people.
Oh, well, I agree. And I want to add to this. I want to say that what we're talking about with this whole concept of platforming, I mean, it's so capitalist, right? Because
Very.
like these conversations would not matter if capitalism wasn't affecting every ounce of every part of life, especially art. Because it's like, well, because of the whole idea of consuming something means you're giving, now our attention is dollars, right? Like that wasn't always the case, but now when we give attention to something, we are, by the nature of how ads work, how marketing works, by giving attention to something, you're giving money to it, which is just a hellscape, right? Like it's just an awful thing that exists. And so I think that's why it's so important to keep that in mind when we talk about deplatforming and the rest of it. Because if we don't talk about those things, then we kind of end up in trouble with some of these ideas. I'm going to transition a little bit now into talking about kind of the satanic panic, because that's very relevant to this conversation about how evangelicals perceive music, and also like what our relationship is with art in general, post satanic panic. Maybe post, maybe we're still in it. We're going to talk about that. So this is my brief summary. The late 1960s and 70s was an era where you had the Manson cult, and you had all these wild murder sprees in 1969, and you had real true stories that kind of placed ritualistic killing as normal conversation staple. Now, to be clear, this wasn't like common per se, but it was certainly like in the news cycle, so to speak. So a lot of people were talking about this idea of ritualistic killings based on what was happening in kind of the late 60s. But in the same era, there was also this organist turned occultist. His name was Anton LaVey, who published the Satanic Bible, which was severely plagiarized, and it mostly just regurgitated early philosophies of self-actualization. But it became pivotal moment for modern Satanism, because it became the key text for the Church of Satan. So then you fast forward through the 70s and you go to 1980, and you have a since discredited memoir called Michelle Remembers. And it became a bestseller, and it was supposedly or allegedly detailing a childhood that was undergoing this horrible sexual abuse in a satanic cult. But the co-authors of the book was this guy named Lawrence Pazder and his wife Michelle Smith. Michelle Smith was a former patient of his that he later married, so that's already sketchy. But basically, he claimed that he had regressed her into childhood through hypnosis, and that he brought up all these memories of past abuse at the Church of Satan. And then he implied basically that this group had existed for centuries, even though there was no evidence of that. But this led to very real world consequences, where there were court cases and investigation into the Church of Satan members, and especially queer folks were targeted, of course. And basically anyone conservatives hated were targeted. Why? Because Christians had this other thing going on where they declared that Satan, or Satan-influenced musicians, were using the subtle messages to subliminally alter children's behavior. So there's this thing called backmasking, which is like a very niche technique, not at all common technique, where it's a real thing where you play music backwards in a track. I mean, during the rock and roll era, there were certainly people playing around with this, but it was a very niche, not a normal thing at all. But Christians had convinced themselves that there was this global satanic cult that was trying to influence kids through rock and roll. Pastor Gary Greenwald was one. He claimed that basically all the subliminal messaging was about trying to convince kids to have sex and use drugs. There were like other popular pastors at the time doing it. The most famous example is there was this group that thought that "Stairway to Heaven" by Led Zeppelin.
Yep, I was going to say that.
Yeah, that if you played it backwards, it would say, "It's my sweet Satan. Oh, I will sing because I live with Satan." It doesn't really sound like that. I've listened to it.
No, I've done it. I rolled my records backwards back in the day.
Oh, did you really?
It has nothing.
Yeah, it's not there. Yeah,
it's a long song too to roll back. Play
it's
backwards.
Like 10 minutes long, isn't it?
It's like 7. Yeah, and we sat there. It's rolling it back, and then every once in a while you hear like "right," and go, "Oh, maybe that was Satan." But there's not a single sentence that's legible in there. So, yeah,
there's something to be said for the like gullibility of Christians, or at least of this brand of Christianity, because that's a story of so much when it comes to pop culture and music, especially. It's just that you can just tell them, like, "Oh, did you know this band? Like, if you play their music backwards, it's devil worship." And then they'll just be like, "Oh yeah, okay, that must be true," and then tell other people. And the next thing you know, there's just like this entire group of people that strongly believe something they maybe have never investigated themselves.
I think that word gullibility is going to come up more than once in this conversation. Because this is kind of my question. Because did the Satanic Panic actually end? Because Aja Romano, she's a culture writer for Vox. She argues, quote, that there are some clear differences between QAnon and the original era of the Satanic Panic. You know, QAnon is a political movement with real political power. And while Satanic Panic was fueled by religious zeal, QAnon is almost a religion unto itself. And then she goes on later to say, still, the tools used to spread both ideas, alarmism, fear-mongering, hysteria, and reports of wildly gothic scenes of blood drinking, children harvested for body parts, and witches are virtually identical. So what do y'all think? Is the satanic panic truly over? Did reason win that battle?
I mean, like, in some ways, yes. As far as like the cultural mainstream goes, it's definitely, I guess you could say reason won the day to some extent. But again, they won the day, not the war. So we see that the resurgence of that coming through QAnon, and it is a different variation of it, but it's if anything, it's worse. It may be more, I don't know, it might be more niche now, but it's also more influential in a way, because it's, like you said, has real political power. There are people in QAnon being voted into office on that platform, just on the basis of their beliefs around QAnon, which is, it's wild to think about. But yeah, I mean, if you wanted to look at it that way, then satanic panic has never really gone away. And I guess I would say it never went away. I wasn't born during I was born at the tail end of the satanic panic being a thing. I'm not old enough to really remember it being part of the cultural milieu, but I mean, as I was mentioning earlier, it definitely had an influence on the way I was raised, the kind of music we listened to, all of that.
Yeah, as someone who was raised in it, we had people come and speak in church about Satanism and stuff. And we even had that guy Mike Warnke come to our church, and he's been completely discredited. He wrote that book about being a high priest in the Church of Satan. Then he admitted he made it all up. Yeah, like John, you had an episode with Asha about abortion, and it's just like, first they didn't care about abortion, and then they needed to, so they needed. It's like so the satanic panic just gave way to whatever the next thing was, fear of gay people, and now fear of lizard people. It's like they need boogeymen to be out there to instill fear, to control, and yeah.
What I mean, a good example of that is the concept of hell, which we've talked about before, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's like you need danger for their message to be compelling, right? Like,
yeah.
If there's nothing scary out there, then there's nothing to save you from. Like, there's not,
right.
And so you have to fearmonger to some extent. I just think it's interesting that it would come in the form of music. I mean, think about an electric guitar, right? An electric guitar, in some sense, should not be a symbol of rebellion, but it is. And I mean, like there's no objective reason why it should be whatever. I remember having a conversation when I was in high school with my parents where they said, well, music can sound angry. And I was like, I guess, but I was really hung up on this concept of like, what does sounding angry mean? Because that's something you have to like attribute to it, right? Like, you can't say that a sound like it was just such an interesting thing. And there's probably a legitimate, I still wrestle with that question about how much of music and just sound waves are like communicating an emotion versus what emotion we ascribe to it. Because I don't know, right? Like, I'm like, I don't, like, especially because I'm a huge jazz fan, right? And jazz is kind of predicated on the idea that sounds do have an emotion. But yeah, I agree. I don't think we won. Maybe the battle was won, but as Chris said so eloquently, exactly. Yeah, I don't think the war is won.
Yeah, they just pivoted.
Well, so why? I mean, we've talked about it a little bit. I mean, we probably all agree that, like, yeah, there's this kind of messaging of like fear secular music, like our sacred music, like our worship music, because this is good, this is bad. With, of course, some disagreements, some spectruming in there. But in general, it's like if the music doesn't glorify God, it's bad. Would probably be like the most milquetoast variety of whatever. But I don't know. Let's pose the question this way. Can sacred music exist just on an individual level? Not necessarily like Christian, but I think about sometimes how like an old hymn will still kind of like touch a part of my soul that not necessarily any kind of music does, or like Dream On by Aerosmith still hurts. It still like hits me a certain way and hurts me a certain way. So like, is that just indoctrination that I'm even asking that question, or what do y'all think? Is there such a thing as sacred music?
Sacred to the individual, I think, is fine. I think when expect everyone to find something sacred in the same way that you get into the cult element of Christianity. So for you, for me, hymns don't really do much for me because I wasn't raised. We sang them, but I was never really into them. But I don't take anything away from your experience, because to you, you have positive associations with that music, and that's great. So yeah, I think the sacred is what we want to have. We want to have something that inspires us or challenges us, makes us feel good. And I think that's why Christianity fights so hard against music, because they know that listening to your favorite song by whatever artist is always going to be a deeper experience than sitting in a church singing whatever together, because it's so personal. It means something to you. It's part of the soundtrack of your life, is the old cliche. When you associate a song or an artist with a time of your life, especially a significant time of your life, that's going to always mean something. And the church has to compete with that. So it's kind of like to answer your previous question, I think it's competition. The church is trying to just destroy the competition by making it forbidden. So their crappy experience that they might provide is like the only game in town.
I agree with that, and I think, I don't know, music can be used as a kind of a cultural flag, or a shibboleth, or whatever you want to call it, because you can use music to draw boundaries of who's in and who's out. You can use music to say this person isn't actually a real Christian. They listen to this kind of music, or they wrote this kind of music, therefore they cannot possibly be a Christian. Or they're certainly not our kind. They're not one of us. And in the reverse, if you do listen to this kind of music, then you're one of us. And the satanic panic aspect of this whole conversation is just a strengthening part of that whole process, as Christians have used music to define who is in and out. They're strengthening what it means to be out. You're not just listening to secular music. You're not just listening to something that's immoral and of this world. You're actually participating in something demonic. And I
were
was
you
struck
taught
by
that
this.
Satan was the angel of music before his great fall? So therefore,
somebody called him God's worship leader or something. Well, and
right?
I heard John near the beginning of our conversation here. John talked about listening to Dream On and being in a trance, I think, or no, maybe it was listening to classic rock,
I
walking
feel
in and
that
hearing
too.
classic rock. Yeah, and both of us, I think, we both reacted to him saying something about a trance, and both, like, I immediately was like, "Yep, that's a red flag." Immediately, as far as I am from what I grew up in, I still hear that and go, "Uh-oh," and then realize, like, I don't care. But I was taught that that's exactly what was happening. You were being put in a trance, and that trance was opening you up to the devil's influence and
Right.
inviting demons into your mind or your heart or whatever.
Yep.
Wow, that's so predatory. Because I'm
Right?
glad I didn't grow up with that specific brand of Christianity, at least in my household.
Yeah.
Certainly in the churches I was at, I'm sure it was there, and I just ignored it. But like, because it's like, well, that's just a human response.
Right.
Like, it's just like everyone who is not, I mean, there's some people who hate music, but they're few and far between. And like, most people will have the experience of hearing a song they love. I mean, I know people who Bruce Springsteen is their guy. For some people it's the Beatles. For some people it's like, some niche artist none of us have ever heard of. Like, everybody has that, like, a connection to that music.
Yeah.
And that is so freaking natural. People had it with Mozart. People had it, with tribal music way back when. Like, there was and so to like spin that a normal human response as like something evil is really, I mean, I said this in the last episode me and Chris had. I actually think it's kind of an abomination what Christians do to music. I almost like want to defend music and as kind of my religion in some ways, and be like, how dare you blaspheme something I care about so much.
Yeah.
Yeah. There it is.
And there it is. But
oh man, I just don't know what to say to that. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
but and maybe that's too extreme. I don't know, because like I mean I go back and forth, right? Because like Chris and I have talked about this. Think about the song like "It Is Well With My Soul," right? Like that like provokes a lot of emotion to most people, right? Like because especially when you learn of the context which it was written and all that stuff. Like that's a powerful song. I also, there's been I can't think of any Hillsong songs because that never friggin' resonated with me. But there's some like, I don't know, like modern Christian music, well, the sense, I mean, this is a bad example now, but Gungor, like there were certain songs by like Gungor that like people would be that kind of hit you in a different way, right? And I don't want to discount the meaning in that. I just am confused about how to wrestle with that, like that sacred feeling that I get when I hear those songs from the very problematic cult, like from the very like obviously controlling, historically damaging religion. Like I don't know how to really separate those two feelings. It could just be the complexity of humanity. I don't know, but there's something there I wish I could pinpoint more articulately.
And what you're describing, there were theologians that were really alarmed at the rise of worship as an industry, as entertainment, and there were a lot of pastors decrying the use of contemporary music in worship because they didn't want it to be the same thing as the Beatles. They wanted it to be this wholly separate thing, and so they lost, obviously, because now worship is like it's like CCM and worship are now kind of the same thing. But yeah, there were theological problems, and so that they saw in the rise of it.
Y'all, we talked about this briefly, but I just wanted to say, was there like, because there's obviously a distinction between worship music and Christian music, even if it's hair thin. What's especially Chris, you brought up the ideas of like Lecrae, or like these ideas of like there's also Christian artists who like I think of like someone like Adam Young from Owl City or something, who like can kind of take their Christian worldview and kind of spin it in a way that's pretty beautiful, like musically and lyrically sometimes. But I don't know, do y'all have like any sort of wrestling or like whatever? I know Scott just probably thinks it all sucks, but like but like any kind of like relationship with that like kind of Christian music that isn't worship music, that isn't even necessarily manipulative, that's more in kind of coming from a place of honesty. Like how do y'all perceive that now, not being Christians anymore?
That's the kind of music I liked. That's the kind of music that was most meaningful to me. I was not a good worship leader in the sense that I didn't listen to worship music. So I was slow to pick up new songs to introduce because I didn't really listen to that kind of music. And there are still Christian bands that I listen to now, only from time to time for throwback purposes. But there's some that still hold up enough for me that don't make me feel severely uncomfortable. There's others that are just out the window where I can't listen to Skillet after some of the more recent stuff that I think his name's John Cooper has like said in some of his concerts and published online and things like that. But I feel way more comfortable with it though. It's something that's weird though that I've noticed in the last almost 10 years, a little less, maybe 8 to 10 years, is this transition of mainstream CCM towards worship music. I remember when I was a kid that what was playing on Christian radio was all over the place. There was a lot of stuff. And it might not be necessarily good but the music in the early 2000s from Christianity was still had some variety and some creativity to it. There was definitely there was an attempt, if you will. Now, if you turn on Christian radio, most of what you hear is going to be different kinds of worship music. It really has become the be all end all of Christian music, and anything else is basically relegated to streaming. And maybe that just says more about who listens to radio these days. That might be a huge part of it, but I don't know. It's just a weird thing I've observed.
Yeah, I think that observation's relevant just in the sense that there's kind of this weird thing happening where there's little the polarization, for lack of a better word, of not just political polarization but like religious polarization, and like this
Yeah.
inability for evangelicals to even pretend to act like they're in the world. They used to say in the world, not of it. Now I'm like, y'all aren't even here. Like y'all, y'all are just like, y'all are really isolating more and more. Scott, one last question for you. When you think of like the spirit of rock and roll, especially that rebellious spirit, do you think what parts of that do you think are like you've alluded to, like how important that was to your deconstruction? I just kind of want to hear more about that. Do you feel like rock and roll is that important? Because it's obviously very specific. It's obviously very like cultural. It's very in a from a particular era and continues because of that era. How important do you think rock and roll, and of course that can be a very broad category, but just kind of that non pop, non oldies, none like just like easy listening music is like, how
Yeah.
important do you think that kind of music is?
I think it's important. I think when I was a kid, it felt like rebellion because we're kind of pushing back at like straight laced conservative people, old people who just don't get it, don't get us. To me, now it's more just like the human condition. Life is hard. There's so much tragedy. There's so much, badness out there that you need an outlet for rage. And I feel like art, not just music, but music's probably the most visceral, spiritual version of it. We need an outlet to rage against whatever the machine, the world, the way things are going. And so it's not so much rebellion as it is just healthy outlets to natural human emotions. And what Christians want to do is tamp down that side of it, right? They're not comfortable with being pissed or having a righteous anger, because even Jesus got pissed. Um,
Yeah.
but they
Flipping
don't
tables is
act that.
pretty hardcore. So
Yeah, and as someone pointed out recently to me, he made a whip, so that takes time. He had time to cool down, but no, he made this whip and then went and kicked ass. It's like he was pissed. That's a natural human part of life, and and if you're actually paying attention to the world, you should be pissed. Not all the time, but to me, like raging music, and I'll include pop and jazz and maybe not easy listening, but any kind of music that kind of like pumps you up and is just like you feel like you're letting loose these emotions. To me is, well, you can call it rebellion, but to me I feel like it's just like a healthy outlet of natural emotions. So maybe it depends on how old you are and the context. If you got parents that are not treating you right, or you got school bully, or sure, it's rebellion against that. But um to me, it's just good old clean anger and rage that should be a part of our lives.
Yeah, I really stand by that. I think maybe because of my experience with music, coming into my own and really resonating with what people, my parents at least, would call angry music. And for me, it was like, no, I'm connecting with the expression of intensity. Sometimes it's rage, sometimes it's desperation, sometimes it's sorrow. But there's a lot going on in this, and these extremes of human emotion, besides joy and happiness, are super important. I also really liked sad music, got really into sad stuff for the same reason. Like I needed that full range of emotional expression, and music offered that in a way that was shorted in the rest of my life at that point.
I think that's so beautiful. Just like the spectrum of human emotion can be communicated through music, and I don't think we should shy away from that, because it ends up being us shying away from our humanity, which only benefits the cult of Christianity.
Nice.
Just a fun question to end. Let's say us three are wrong and the evangelicals are right. Okay. So all three of us, we get to see each other in hell, and we're like, "Hey, how's it going? Guess we were wrong."
Or we
So
were
we start a
right.
band.
No,
Yeah.
yeah, we started bad. Well, this is the thing. So Satan or one of his minions comes up and he goes, "Hey, your sentence is to sing, because you all love music. Your sentence to sing one Christian song for the rest of your life." So
Huh.
I want the answer to two different questions. If you are given the option to choose, which song do you choose to sing for the rest of your life in hell? And it has to be a Christian song. But if you don't get to choose, what would be the worst, like, actual hell for you to sing forever? Chris, we'll start with you. I'll give Scott time to think about this since he's got
Oh,
too good
that's
a taste of music.
Well, it's been a long
So,
time too.
yeah, but Chris, so you get to choose one. Like, you're like, if I'm in hell having to sing this the rest of my life, I'm gonna make the best of it. Which one do you sing? And if you if you don't get the option, what's the worst one that they make you
oh
sing?
man. Oh, that's a hard one. There's a part of me that was gonna try to name like a really like one right off the bat. Um, and say like I'm gonna go hard, I'm gonna embrace it, that I'm in hell, so I might as well be miserable, so I'm gonna sing this miserable song for the rest of my life. But that's lame. I want to actually also the realization that if I repeat anything enough I'm going to hate it, so I might as well just take something I already hate. um
I'll start with the one that I would be sentenced
yeah, go
to
for it,
if I
because I
didn't get
think I
to
can think
choose.
of mine. Go ahead.
I'm sure you are not surprised by this, Chris. If I had no choice, it would be Refiner's Fire. Like, just having
Oh,
to say
Oh, not
Refiner's
even know that
Fire
one.
for the rest of my life, I mean, that's hell.
the rest of eternity.
Yeah,
So
that's it.
it's funny because I think we talked about that and quite a while ago, and I brought that song up to you as one of those nightmare
I mean,
worship songs.
How He Loves by David Crowder is a close second, but
See, I don't hate that one quite as much, although I do now more than I used to, because it's just so repetitive and was ubiquitous for a while. You kind of stole that one from me. Refiner's Fire is like one of my nightmare worship songs for sure. I was gonna pick something a little more contemporary, so it's gonna be that "You're a Good Good Father" one. So I could just
oh
repeat
God,
over and over
flashbacks to
again.
Moody.
You're a
Scott,
good, good father.
Scott, if
It's
you're
who
not
you are.
familiar,
It's who
Not
yeah,
you
familiar.
are.
No.
Yeah. Oh,
it's literally, yeah, you are good father, and I'm loved by you is what you say more than anything. Like, for
Wow.
like
well,
what feels like
those are the
hours.
meaningful parts. The rest of it is just it's who you are and it's who I am over and over and over again. Beautiful, beautiful, absolutely fantastic.
That's art,
If
baby.
Just no descriptions, just
that's
so
art,
vague.
baby.
Yeah.
Trying to think, because I can think of the song, I just can't think of the name. It is actually a David Crowder song, but it's from like the early 2000s, late 90s, from like before he became a thing. He had a very raw worship song that maybe I would have been like, oh yeah, this is the one I'll choose. Partly because there is that, like, if I'm in hell, then I'm gonna sing a mournful worship song for sure. I just can't remember the name of it. It's All I Can Say is the name of it. And at one point, one of the verses says something along the lines of, wasn't it you I gave my heart to? I wish you'd remember where I set it down, or where you set it down. And I'm like, that's kind of
Dang.
accusatory. Yeah, when I
Yeah.
first heard that, when I first heard that song, I was like just floored. That was
Wow.
I wasn't ready for that.
That's when Christian music can be beautiful, when it actually says, God, what the fuck?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
like, why are you letting this happen to me? that's when Christian music is good.
Yes.
And it's which psalms are good. Okay, fair enough. Scott, you have any ideas in mind?
I was trying to, but really, if I have to sing a worship song, it's just they're all going to end up being bad. So just pick one. I'll sing it. I'll and suffer. And yeah,
Oh man.
just
Well, what if you had to
hand
say?
me my accordion and
What if
You cut out on my end. Tell me, I gotta know. What did you say?
Oh, I said pick one. Any of them will work.
they're all terrible to
They're
him?
just
They'll
all
all make
bad.
me
Okay, so
suffer.
you just there is no
Well, how about this,
choice.
Scott?
Just
You
What
were
about
a little
Jesus
bit.
loves me?
Okay,
See,
as the
Yes,
real
I know.
creepy. Jesus,
as the good or the bad.
bad.
But yeah, how about this, Scott? They're like, Scott was a little bit better of a person than John or Chris. He was just a smidge better. So you get to choose one song. You still have to repeat it for all eternity, so you'll hate it eventually. But if you could only sing one song, it doesn't have to be Christian. What would that song be?
Yeah, one song, huh?
Torture, right?
Yeah, but it's a song I like.
Yeah, I mean, you're choosing it, so,
Okay.
so hopefully you like it a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know. I'll just go genre. Like pick a U2 song. I can usually do that.
Ooh.
You see, that sounds like hell to me. Like it's actually
John
see,
doesn't
U2
like
used to be
U2 very
cool.
much.
No, I know. I don't
old
like them
U2.
anymore. But if you go back, they were cool once before they got uber famous. They were cool. They were. Yeah.
I mean, they have some good songs. I'm not denying
Joshua
that.
Tree is pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah, Joshua Tree and before.
Yeah, Joshua Tree was really
That's
really
when they
did
entered.
me in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like this. I like that album. I like the stuff on there. But yeah, after that, it starts to get.
I can't live with or without
Yeah, not my
you.
favorite
I'm just
song,
like,
but
Okay, no, that just makes me think of Friends. That literally every time I hear it, I think of that one
Really?
episode
No,
of
you
Friends.
think
it's become a
the
meme.
compilation of Ross and Rachel, just like,
Yes.
oh man,
Yeah, no,
that's funny. What a '90s baby thing to associate with it. That's so funny.
Didn't that come out in the 90s? It came out in like.
It
90,
came out in
didn't it?
'87.
Yeah.
Did it?
Yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah. No, but Friends took it and ran with it.
Well, yeah, they did. Oh yeah, 87.
Awesome.
Right.
86. Yeah, 87. Yeah. So
awesome.
yeah.
Well, thank you guys. This was a fun conversation. I know it's kind of an interesting niche, but I think it's actually really important to kind of explain ourselves.
Explain yourself.
And say what's going on. Scott, tell everyone about the work you're doing and where they can find out more about what you're doing.
Oh yeah, since the last time I was on this podcast, I have a book deal that should be coming out in April. It's called Asian American Apostate. I have a podcast called Chapel Probation that John and Chris have been on. That was a good time. So yeah, look up Chapel Probation, rscottokamoto.com. All the things are there.
Yeah, I can't wait. I'm gonna read it as soon as pre-orders are available. Whatever the deal is, I'm on it. So I can't wait to read it.
Cool.
And yeah, Chapel Probation is awesome. Me and Chris's episode was quite fun.
Yeah, it was awesome.
Talking about our wild college experiences. Yeah, awesome. And Chris, you have nothing to promote. You're just here to say
I'm here to say go check out Scott's podcast, Chapel Probation. It's a good listen. I would tell you to go listen to John's, but you're already listening to it, so that would be really weirdly meta.
Listen again.
Listen again. Go back.
Go ahead and rewind.
Don't listen to any of the old episodes with me on it.
No.
Because it's just painful.
Oh no, it's not.
No, listen to it.
That's
listen to it. Yeah, listen to it in reverse. Listen to it backwards for the secret satanic message.
Yeah.
Listen to it backwards and you'll hear us say, honestly, listen to it forwards and you'll hear us say we love Satan. You don't have to listen to it backwards. You'll just hear it forwards.
I'd have to believe
dig
in
that
Satan
hard.
to love Satan. That's the problem.
Yeah, the catch-22. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, guys. I appreciate it. And thank you, listener, for stopping by. I'll talk to y'all soon.
Yes, will as a him so well. Yes, you samste. Yes, will as a him so well. Yes, you samste.
If you'd like to learn more about this podcast or other work I'm doing, go to thecultofchristianity.com. If you'd like to support this podcast, listen, follow, share, and consider subscribing for $5 through Spotify for additional content, or give as much or as little as you can to support this work through links in the show's notes. Every dollar helps further this important discussion as well as start other exciting projects. Thanks for listening, and remember to keep love in your life, hope in your heart, and searching in your soul.